Hello and welcome to Spotlights. This is the podcast for the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. And as usual, I'm your host, Sam Mickey. And this week I'm really excited to welcome onto the show Rabbi Ellen Bernstein. Ellen, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So you are a leading figure in the world of religion and ecology and have been for a long time. But for folks who don't know your work, I'll just say a little bit about you. What you founded Shomrei Adamah, Keepers of the Earth, the first national Jewish environmental organization, and that was in 1988. So we'll want to definitely talk more about that. So you wear many hats. You're, rabbi, author, ecotheologian. You write and teach at the intersection of Judaism, Bible, and ecology, and author of several pieces, books, edited collections, articles. I think some of the most noteworthy one is The Splendor of Creation from 2006, where you do a kind of ecotheology focusing on Genesis 1, which obviously is a very contested thing. And I know you have a piece that you wrote in Tikkun last year on domination is not exploitation. So again, thinking about Genesis 1. And then you also have this wonderful book, The Promise of the Land, which is an ecologically centered Passover Haggadah. Another very, very cool project. And, since we're here on the Forum on Religion and Ecology's podcast, it's worth noting you're also in the advisory group for the forum and some other groups. You're the steering committee of Third Act Faith, advisory board of the Green Sabbath Project. That's a very cool project. So many things in the world of theory and in practice that you're doing. So to start off, one of the things I always like to hear about is how did you get into this kind of work? I think for some people in religion, the world of ecology doesn't really matter. And some folks in the world of ecology, they're not going to try and apply it to religion. They're just going to leave it the world of science and policy. So for you, how did these worlds come together?
Well, it's really very old for me, started from my childhood. I didn't have much Jewish background. But I was always like a very spiritually oriented young person that spent all my time outdoors. And it's kind of a long, convoluted story, but I ended up going to boarding school. And this boarding school that I went to was started by D.L. Moody, the evangelist. He also started Middlebury College. So I went to Northfield School, and we were required to take religion classes. And this was in 1969. So I was taking religion, and I took probably one of the very first environmental studies classes also at Northfield in 1969.
Oh, wow.
And though, I was a pretty troubled young person, I had a difficult, upbringing, and nature was my savior. And being able to study this stuff in high school, it really saved my life. And gave me the direction for the rest of my life. So it, whereas for some people it might sound, like what you said, religion and science, don't go together. But for me, it was always one and the same. And, like a couple of hundred years ago, it was religious people were totally into natural history and, so I feel like I'm kind of out of that, Emersonian tradition.
Yeah, right. It's crazy to think that was folks like Emerson, not even a couple hundred years, and already we treat it like it's, oh well, of course religion and science are in conflict. Like they haven't been for a long time, and we just invented this sharp distinction recently, and then everybody's like, well, there's no way to bridge that gap.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so then I went on to go to one of the first environmental studies programs in the country at UC Berkeley.
Cool.
And I started getting into Judaism more in Berkeley through various, sort of alternative experimental paths.
Nice.
So that's the very beginning parts. I mean, do you want me to talk a little bit more about how I brought that together?
Yeah, I'd love to hear it. I like hearing the early background as well. But so then especially once you go to Berkeley, weird place. And I lived in Berkeley for a number of years. I moved out just a few years ago, so now I'm in the North Bay. But wonderful town, really cool school, and so I'd imagine that that really opened up a lot of possibilities. So yeah, what was kind of your next step from there?
Well, again, I was in one of those very early interdisciplinary studies programs at Berkeley, and I was originally kind of pre-med,
Mhm.
uh, but doing all this biology, anatomy, comparative anatomy, all this, natural sciences,
Right.
um, and just sort of leaning more towards ecology all the time. Um, and I got a teaching credential to teach life sciences in high school, and I taught at Berkeley High for a few
Oh.
years. Um, and then I started running wilderness river trips. I ended
Oh.
up meeting this friend in Northern California. I worked for the California Conservation Corps.
Hmm.
And I got a job in Mount Shasta at the California Conservation Corps. So it was bringing kids out into wilderness and doing all of these, trail restoration and planting projects and all that kind of stuff for the Forest Service. And I hooked up with this guy as a friend, and we ended up founding a whitewater rafting company
Oh, really?
and taking folks. Yeah. And so for like several summers, I worked with him. It was called Turtle River. And we would take folks out on the river and for like 5-day trips. And, um, and I was really interested in teaching like the ecological and biological dimensions of sort of being out on the river while we
Yes.
were having a great time. And actually, once we took out this Methodist group, and every summer we would take the same Methodist group out, and we would have these Sunday morning services that I would lead. Um, and like I would gather all of this great natural history writing, like these great nature writers like Annie Dillard and
Mhm.
Lauren Isley, and I put together services kind of just based on this great writing. And people used to joke that I was like the rabbi of the river. So those were the very early days. And then I was just getting into Judaism. I really didn't know I had like very little background.
Hmm.
Um, the most background I had was by studying religion in high school,
Hmm.
and then slowly getting in through this thing called this group called the Aquarian Minyan in Berkeley.
Huh.
It
That
was wild.
sounds like something that would be in Berkeley.
It was wild. It still exists. It's
Oh, cool.
wonderful. It's a wonderful group of people. Actually, these people a lot of them came from very religious backgrounds,
Hmm.
but it was too like confining, and they were more open-minded. So you got like with this group, you were um, really kind of getting the real thing Jewishly. I mean, this is not Reform Judaism or conservative Judaism. A lot of these people really came from very, very strong Jewish backgrounds. So that was how I was getting, I was getting involved Jewishly that way. And I started studying one-on-one with someone in this group.
Hmm.
And so we started reading the portion of the week. Each week in Judaism, you go portion by portion through the whole
Right.
Hebrew Bible. And I was just blown away. I had this ecology background, and we started studying Genesis 1.
Hmm.
And, probably spent like 2 months just studying Genesis 1. I was like, I can't believe there's all this stuff in here
Yeah.
that I never knew about. And so I spent a year with this friend going through, and then it was like, well, is there a Jewish environmental organization? I spent several years looking for a Jewish environmental organization, and there wasn't anything. And so ultimately I ended up, through some convolutions, moving to Philadelphia. And this neighborhood that I live in, again, I just moved back here, called Mount Airy in Philadelphia, is sort of the home of Reconstructionist Judaism.
Oh,
And it's also the home of the Jewish renewal movement. Um, and so it's a very vibrant, it's like Berkeley, but it's a vibrant Jewish community. There's lots of Jews doing really interesting stuff still, here now. Um, and so basically, when I moved here and started looking for a Jewish environmental organization, I would ask people, is there one? And people would say, no, and you have to start one. So that's basically what happened. I had no idea what I was doing. I had like zero Jewish background. I just really believed, it was like this intuition stuff, but also really believing that that environmental problems were spiritual problems. They were caused by people's value, like people's values gone amok, and
yeah,
just greed and people taking much more than they need, and this exponentially, growing. And yeah, so I started Shomrei Adamah in 1988. With a few people on a board, having meetings in my backyard. And then I wrote a grant proposal and I sent it to 80 different places. I had no idea what I was doing. I had no organizational background. I had taught biology. And so it's just this, just this passionate belief that religious people ought to be in the forefront of the environmental movement,
yeah,
and just not understanding why they weren't. And also, like, in the Jewish world, just feeling like, you guys, this is going to attract young Jews. Like, what,
it's true.
even if you don't care about this, like having to go to funders and that sort of thing. And like, even if you don't connect with this whole environmental thing, this is what's going to keep Jews Jewish.
Yeah.
And in fact, that is a lot of the money I got was because of framing it like that.
Interesting.
So, yeah,
Yeah, I like that point a lot. There's so many reasons to get involved with religious environmentalism. And one is it's just a way to keep your tradition alive and vibrant. And like, I don't care about nature at all, but I want kids to come back. And
right,
so you're like, well, this is where people are really interested right now.
right.
Yeah, and I appreciate that it's also just so obvious for you that like environmental crisis is a spiritual crisis. How is that not coming through? Seems like even back when you were the rabbi of the river, you had that sense of connection. And I feel like that's missing in a lot of like that kind of outdoor education. Sometimes it's just like, oh, we're just spending time outdoors, but you
Mm.
don't necessarily get the nature writing, the spirituality. So I like that you're weaving those together with outdoor education. I think that's really powerful, and that just leads. You're just like it just seems obvious. Let's get out there.
I want to say one more thing about that, because I've noticed actually, I don't know if you ever go to the conferences on religion, nature, and culture.
Ah, yeah.
So I went to the one in Cork,
Oh, nice.
and it was fascinating because there were a couple of scholars, I think like from Sweden, or that were talking about how the young environmentalists like Greta and company, like that whole age cohort, like it's totally political for them, and it's not, there isn't this whole sense of of a love of nature.
Hmm.
And they're very effective, but what concerns me is the sustainability of, like, how do you keep the work alive for the rest of
Right.
your life? And because that's what it's about, right? And we need to be sustained in the work as we do it. And so that's why so much that the spiritual dimension feels so important, like to keep the work alive.
Yeah.
And instead of people burning out after a couple of years.
Yeah. No, that's true.
Yeah,
Especially as like the climate crisis and people like Greta, it's like this is very intense emotionally to deal with this kind of work. And if you don't have some spiritual grounding, burnout is pretty inevitable.
yeah,
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I hadn't really thought of that. How that younger cohort of environmentalists, yeah, very concerned with the politics of things and very like post-capitalist, anti-capitalist thinking, and I'm like,
Right,
okay, good. Anything about spirituality here? And they're like, we don't have time for that.
right, right.
No, we need it.
Right. Yeah. And, I just fear for them. And also, right, again, the whole climate anxiety stuff and climate
Yeah,
grief. And to me, those things are so big. They're so big and important. And they're so, um, obstacles now to people engaging,
yeah,
because people have fear and anxiety, and they're stuck, and so that's why the love and the beauty just feels, that's what's nourishing, you know?
yeah, right. And even when things are really bad, the beauty of creation's still there, and that your love of nature can still be there, even when there's wildfires here, drought there, floods there, climate crisis, mass extinction. Like, yeah, but the sun still rises and sets, and there's still so much beauty. There's still so much we can save, and
Right,
yeah, keeping that love going is crucial for that kind of work.
right, right. And I also have really felt like that, you know, um, that one of our biggest problems is that we're so siloed and so ideological about environmental stuff. And so to me, it's at least as important to be reaching people on the other side ideologically
Yeah.
as anything. I just, and so to me, like communicating this, I feel like everyone shares this love of nature, and to be able to join together with people around, in this common love for our future, you know is a much easier way of engaging people than telling people what to do.
Yeah.
I think, a lot of my work has been in response to heavy-handed moral messaging,
Mm.
which I think is a turnoff to a lot of people. Yeah.
Yeah, nobody wants to get kind of scolded. Like, oh, you're not doing things right. Change your lifestyle. Do this. Your politics are wrong. Your
Or,
lifestyle's
being
wrong.
called out, and, I mean, it's really hard.
Yeah. And it's just become so divisive. It reminds me of the climate scientist Catherine Hayhoe. She often makes this point, like the best thing we can do about climate change is talk about it. But to talk about it doesn't mean you have to be scolding people. It means talk about the stuff you have in common. And like a
Mhm.
lot of us are like, well, do you love your kids? Like, yeah, do you love a sunny day? Like, uh-huh. Yeah, okay. So it turns out we have a lot more in common than we do different. And we have this common love of friends, family, relationships, being in nature. Like we have all that in common. Why are we letting some of these divisions and things, tear us apart and prevent us from acting together?
Right. Yeah.
Well, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about what you were doing at Keepers of the Earth. I mean, because again, this is such a foundational organization. You're
Sure.
out there looking for something, nothing's there. And so you're like, I guess I'll learn grant writing, which to me, that's something I've never tried to do. That seems very intimidating. And so getting that thing going, and I think it was around for maybe a decade, and then you kind of stopped it and move on to some other stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what were you doing for that decade?
During the decade. Um, so, um, so in the beginning, we came up with, I had to build a board and I had to raise money. And I should say that some of my first two grants, one was from John Hunting, who ran the Belden Fund, and he was always on the lookout for folks doing religion and ecology. And he funded Shomrei Adamah because he saw it as a model. I was like, the first like three or four people doing religion and ecology. So people were looking for like, how do you target different audiences? Like different audiences need different environmental messages.
Right.
So, so anyway, so all of that strategic stuff of figuring out, well, how are you going to sell this product to foundations, and um, so so in the beginning, it was, we just came up with these ideas about developing green synagogues, right? What do like a whole series of things that you can do to green your synagogue,
Nice.
right? To green the physical plant and also to green activities. And then, so there was that. So this is like the first year, kind of the ideas that we were going to work on. There was the decision to work on a curriculum, which took a couple of years. It's called Let the Earth Teach You Torah. And it was a high school curriculum on Judaism and ecology. So there were those things. And then we worked on just having this really wonderful newsletter. It's fascinating. I always encourage people to go to my website and check out the newsletter. If you were to go read it, it would be just like today. I mean, the stuff that we're talking, I mean, not the language of climate change so much, but everything else, but the same issues.
Yeah.
And so those were the first kinds of things that we were doing. The curriculum took a few years, and over time I was, able to hire staff, and we also did stuff like running. We ran a few wilderness trips to take people out and give them an experience of. There were actually water canoe trips. We ran one in Utah and one in Maine, to give people an experience of wilderness and like teaching ecological stuff in the wilderness. But there was so much for me to learn as somebody, I mean, I learned as I went, right? And just about like how to run an organization and what you do and what you say no to, right? There was so much. I mean, we were the only ones on the block doing it, and everybody wanted, everybody would come to us for everything that was remotely related to Judaism and ecology. And I had to realize, I have X skills and I don't have these other skills. And so originally there were all these chapters that bubbled up, and we had to basically cut that because, people were going off and saying all these things in the name of Shomrei Adamah, the name of the organization, that were totally wrong, So basically we pulled in from doing like chapter work and just focused on educational work. I mean, there was so much to do of really developing a foundation in Jewish ecological thought. So that was what the curriculum was about. We partnered with Hadassah, which is this huge Jewish organization, and did a book for them on Judaism and ecology. It's a women's organization. So it was a book that they would use during the year for like their monthly gatherings, and they study a chapter each month. So there was just a lot of educational kinds of things, and a lot of speaking gigs and conferences. And
right. That's such cool work. That's great. I like that you still kept the wilderness trips involved.
Right.
So still Rabbi of the River
Right.
after all those years.
Right. Oh, but I forgot to say, like, maybe the most important thing. The way that Shomrei Adamah started, like the very first thing this was actually even before Shomrei Adamah started, the year before Shomrei Adamah started, I worked on the Jewish holiday Tu B'Shvat, the New Year of the Trees. And so Judaism is this really cool minor holiday that's a holiday for trees. And it was all about paying taxes on your fruit trees. And it was not seen as a significant holiday. It was just a minor holiday in the calendar. But in the 1600s, the mystics who lived in Sfat in Israel, these Kabbalists, they developed a Seder, a ritual for this holiday. Anyway, I'm not going to go into all the details, but I was able to take what the Kabbalists did and transform it into a Seder that's based on earth, water, air, and fire, based on the four elements or four habitats in a way. And so I wrote this Haggadah, which is a little guidebook to the holiday. And I partnered with the Philadelphia Parks Department, and we got the use of one of the boathouses, these iconic boathouses on the Schuylkill River, and had this enormous festival celebrating Tu B'Shvat. And it was open to the public, and there were all these artists and musicians that participated. So it was one of these things that, you know, took months to produce, to get people engaged and produce. And it was actually the second year I did it, was covered by National Public Radio. And for me, doing holiday work has always been really important, because again, it's about like, how do you reach people in joy?
Right.
So that you engage people instead of like telling people what to do.
Yeah.
I feel like the more that you can reach people in terms of abundance and their own, you know, like their own connection to the holiday or to the earth, then, I mean, that feels like this really important first step. Because I just find over and over, people come up with these like to-do lists of ways to try to get people involved in a synagogue or a church. And it's very pedestrian. And, you know, it's like, okay, we're going to do X, Y, Z, you know, and there's no flavor, you know, and there's no color, and there's no sensuality. And it just feels like completely divorced from what it means to live in the natural world. Right. And so the holidays for me have been a way of really sort of lifting up all the beauty, and engaging people that way.
I like that, especially that it's things like what might seem like a minor holiday in a lot of contexts, and you can just lift it up. Like, well, no, there's these Kabbalists who did a little bit more with it. We can bring that back. And it's one of those things that we don't realize how many resources there are in our own traditions for this kind of work, for celebratory work with nature. And I just like that point so much, that we don't need more kind of condescending moralizing. We need joy, we need pleasure, we need celebration, festivity. It reminds me, you know, of like Martin Luther King didn't write an "I have a nightmare" speech. It's like, I have a dream. And so there's got to be some kind of positive celebratory vision. You know, you don't say, oh, we should stop hating. It's like, well, no, remind people of the love.
Right.
And holidays are just such a great way to do that. So and that's kind of like a Jewish Earth Day of sorts then.
Well, through my work, it was like really lifting it up that way. It was, you know, the Kabbalists. So in the beginning, it was just a day to pay taxes on the fruit trees.
Right.
Okay. And then the Kabbalists, they took it in these mystical, symbolic directions, which to me were very earthy, but most people, you know, a lot of people don't, they celebrate Tu B'Shvat, but they don't celebrate it from a Kabbalistic perspective. So yeah, so I took what the Kabbalists did to sort of make it more explicitly ecological. It, you know, and I feel like that's a lot of what my work has been, is taking stuff that's implicit, that people can't see that it's ecological, and just trying to, you know, shift the lens so you can see the language, you know, like for me, Judaism and the Bible have their own ecological language. You know, it's not going to speak, you know, American ecology.
Right. That's true. Yeah.
And it's just lifting all of that up.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that a lot. And it's just needs a little tweak to kind of unfold that. You're like, it's right there. It just needs to be kind of translated, unfolded a little bit, and yeah, and then it's not going to sound like American ecology. It's not the same as talking about like population dynamics or something like that. And yeah, like, well, it's going to sound
the word
different.
environment, you know, it's not going to have that.
Yeah, right. That word has caused a lot of trouble. Everybody's like, oh, the environment, the environment. It's like, there's other words. there's,
Right,
there's other
right,
words to talk about it. Some of them are a lot more fun and more packed with interesting symbolism and that kind of
right,
stuff.
right, right.
Well, I wonder along those lines, I want to talk more about Genesis 1, because that's one of those cases where it's not about the environment, right? It's the language is so different. And of course, there's that very famous or infamous piece by Lynn White Jr. from back in the 60s on
Right.
the roots of our ecological crisis. And he's kind of blaming the Bible. And he really blames, Christianity seems like really to blame. He's like, that's the most anthropocentric religion ever. And then anthropocentrism, dot, 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 environmental crisis.
Right.
And so he really picks on Genesis 1 in particular and Genesis 1:26 or whatever, make humans subdue and have dominion and all this kind of
Right.
stuff. And it turns out that he's kind of misreading that.
Well, actually, he doesn't say that specifically. It's other people that take his word. He never
Mm.
actually quotes Genesis 1:26.
Oh.
Yeah, I've looked at a bunch but I feel like people, kind of people then take what he said and then transfer it back to, you know, to to that verse specifically.
Right.
So he might have used the word dominion, but he actually, as far as I remember, he doesn't quote that verse. Um, but anyway, so ask me your question again.
Well, I guess I could frame it this way. Uh, Splendor of Creation, mainly really unpacking Genesis 1, right?
Yeah.
And so, what are you finding in Genesis 1? Because you're definitely
Okay,
not finding just your old fashioned anthropocentrism.
right. No,
Yeah.
not at all.
Yeah.
So for me, like basically what I did with Splendor of Creation was go line by line, unpacking each verse of Genesis 1 and finding all of these like really cool ecological ideas that were buried inside of it
Hmm.
that no one ever pointed out. And I feel like most, a lot of people haven't read my book um, and and still don't see. I feel like tons of people, including tons of rabbis, are down on Genesis 1. Like they don't want to even talk about like it's like, whoa, don't talk to me about Genesis 1. That's like the evil uh chapter of our Bible. And give me Genesis 2, which has like the stewardship stuff in it,
Right.
and but people want to distance themselves from Genesis 1 because of the language of dominion. But okay, so just to give you a few examples, um, on the third day, a third day of creation in the Bible, any child who's been through Christian Sunday school, maybe Jewish Sunday school, knows that what they'll tell you, you ask them what happens on the third day of creation, and they'll tell you that the trees were created. Um, but in fact, if you do a close reading of those two verses, which is like Genesis 1:11 and 12, what the word that keeps being repeated over and over in the Hebrew is seed, zera. And so you have this sense that that's what's actually created on the third day is the process for resilience and the process for reproduction and the process for sustainability through seeds,
Mm.
right? So that happens on the third day. Then there are all these other references to the importance of reproduction, regeneration. So you have the seeds. You also have this phrase repeated 10 times in Genesis 1, after its kind. Everything that's created is created after its kind. And there's a sense of the importance of the continuity of species, right?
Mm.
So that's another sustainability hint. Another sustainability hint is on the, if you were to ask most people who haven't like spent a lot of time thinking about Genesis 1, who gets the first blessing? who gets the first blessing? And everybody will say, humanity gets the first blessing. Humanity doesn't get the first blessing. The fish and the birds get the first blessing. And the blessing is to be fruitful and multiply. That's who gets the blessing to be fruitful and multiply, is the fish and the birds. So another sustainability, mandate. So it's like woven throughout. And then the very last line is really bizarre. If you look at the Hebrew, the very last line of the story, Genesis 2:3, it says, so on the seventh day, God had finished from the work that God had made. And then it ends. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it, God rested from all the work that God had created to make. It ends with this infinitive verb. It's totally weird. And it's sort of like God had done all of this work. It rested from the work, which was about making more of itself.
Right.
It's sort of this sense that this making is continuing. So you have, so it's like, from a literary perspective, you have these like 4 different ideas of sustainability threaded through Genesis 1, and then it ends, right? It tops it off in a very hidden way at the end about making more.
Right.
And it just seems like, that's just one element of Genesis 1 that I found really fascinating. That really what it's all about is creation, regeneration. It's always regenerating. And like, it's like the most important idea in ecological thought.
Yeah.
That's
That's great. Wow. How interesting, especially just the little verb to make just hiding there. It's so easy to just read that and be like, yeah, it's just old. The Bible's weird. It's written,
right.
And it's like, no, it's about the stuff he created.
Right.
Oh, he created it to make.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. So it's like, regenerative ecology right there in the very beginning.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I like that it's also attention to species too, and not just individual organisms. We're thinking about whole kinds.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And that's just one, again, I wrote a whole book on this. So, also everything that was created was good, right? You get the repetition of the word good. That's the most obvious thing, that you get the word good happening 7 times in the story, and everything is good. Everything has integrity, right? This is like ecological integrity. That's what goodness is.
Yeah.
It deserves to live, not by any human measure. It's not a human measure. It's, it's a God measure.
Right.
And
so not anthropocentric at all.
Right, exactly. It's not at all anthropocentric. And so and again, I could go on and on, but I'm sure we have other things to talk about. So, but what happened with the Dominion stuff is it's a problematic word. And so it's clearly possible to interpret God giving humanity dominion as a negative thing if you just look at the word dominion and think it means domination. But you have to look at the context of the story. It just makes absolutely no sense for God to develop this incredible world and then develop humans to exploit it. It's like, it doesn't make any sense at all.
Yeah.
And, it just always felt like people are looking for something, first, and also the Dominion stuff has been used negatively throughout history, right? It's not, the doctrine of discovery and all these horrible things.
Yeah, that's a good example.
Yeah. So, okay, I understand. I understand why people have a hard time with it, but that's not how it's supposed to be read. And as long as we continue to read it that way, we're disempowering the most powerful ecotheology in the Bible.
Yeah.
And then people want to go to Genesis 2, which is about stewardship, but it's much more human-centered.
That's true. Yeah.
It's all about what we do. It's not like saying like that, like the amazing miraculousness of the natural world itself, which is what Genesis 1 is trying to teach you.
Right. Yeah. It's not just Adam naming the animals and stuff. And
Right.
yeah, it's God doing all the talking.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, everybody, well, let's just talk about that nice garden. And like, well, we're really missing something. And to think that Genesis was foundational for Christianity, for like all the Abrahamic religions. You're talking like billions of people can trace their wisdom back to this. And then when we just let people misread it and let
Right.
the misreadings be the preferred reading, we're really pulling the rug from under this
Right.
whole tradition.
Right. And not so for me, like I always, I my old fantasy was like instead of the Gideon's Bible in hotels, to have the Splendor of Creation or something like, like a green reading of the Bible.
Yeah.
And but I think, what you just said is really true, like about disempowering people. I wrote the Splendor of Creation because I really thought we could engage the Jewish and Christian, I mean, the Christian world is so much bigger, but like if we got Christians to see the ecological roots of our tradition, like, and the Genesis 1 is the most popular story,
Yeah.
right? It's the one that everybody knows, like, and if that became our myth, our ecological myth, like that we told around the campfire.
Right. Yeah, and to think people must have had that sense for like in early Judaism, they weren't misreading it. And those misreadings seem to come later. So to imagine like, wow, what must early Judaism have been like when they had that story and they had a better understanding of like why God put us here and what dominion really meant. I wonder if you could say a little bit more like what's dominion mean then in like the positive sense of
Mm-hmm.
dominion and the sense of dominion that's not domination, it's not exploitation, but of course shares a root with domination. But what's dominion?
um So, okay, I want to just go back for a second to something you said first. First of all, okay, the way that Jews look at texts often is through the eyes of the rabbis. So they'll look for the commentaries on. They'll
Right.
get interested in what the commentators throughout history said on different verses.
Right.
Like there's like zero about dominion.
Hmm.
Why? Because Jews never had dominion. Jews, were victims. I mean,
Right.
they lived on, they never had their own land. So it was a complete non-issue. It was just not even ever
Right.
talked about. And what they did comment on in that verse, it's be fruitful and multiply and have dominion over the earth, etc. They commented on the be fruitful and multiply part,
Hmm.
and that's what they were interested in is like, the obligations of their own sustainability of their own people.
Yeah.
Um, so, um, yeah. So yeah, dominion was a non-issue.
That's so interesting. Yeah, that's such
Not
important context.
was a
Like,
total non-issue.
of course, we're not dominating anything. It's the other
Yeah,
way around.
yeah,
Yeah,
right, exactly. We're being dominated by other
that's
other
good.
peoples. Um, anyway, but there were some commentators that said some stuff about it. And basically, what with Rashi, who's like the premier medieval commentator, talked about how he looked at the Hebrew word for have dominion over, which is the Hebrew resh dalet hey, and basically he said he saw a pun in the text that you can see the word have dominion over in one of its grammatical forms is the same as to go under,
Hmm.
to go under. And that's in Genesis 1:26. And he said, if we uphold our sort of dominion and in a positive way, it right, dominion does have two sides. If we do what we are supposed to do and uplift, like, up, you know, help the creation in whatever way to, or just not get in the way of the creation making more of itself and doing what it needs to do, and just ensuring that the creation continues, then we will have dominion. And if we don't, we will, and so we'll be above it, like have dominion over. And if we like disregard our responsibility to the creation, then we'll sink below it. We'll go under.
Right.
And we'll be kind of ruined by it.
That's good.
So there's this sense right in there that it's like the dominion is a conditional thing, that it's up to us, that dominion is kind of neutral in a way, like it has multiple meanings, and we need to lift it up, right? And for me, the Bible is an expression of what humanity does. It's not predictive. It's descriptive. Like
right.
these are what humans are going to do, whether you like it or not,
Right.
and we have these, this is our human challenge. In some ways, it feels like, in so many aspects of life, right? This whole dominion thing, right? White privilege, et cetera. It's, racism. Yeah. It's like the dominion piece, it is our challenge.
Yeah.
And I think that to just say, forget about Genesis 1 because dominion is there, just means that we're not taking responsibility in a way.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. You're just ignoring it and pretending it's not there instead of realizing, look, there's a real duality here. We have to choose what kind of dominion we have.
Right.
And one kind of dominion is going to lead to like mutual flourishing. We help the earth supports us. The other kind of dominion basically leads to like us sawing off the limb we're sitting on. You destroy nature, you're going down with it.
Right.
Yeah, that's really great. Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. I'll have to keep that in mind. That's such a different way to think about it. I mean, after all, dominion, like the dome, just means like home, and so it doesn't have to mean domination.
Right.
Yeah.
No, and I think that that's really important. The dome means home.
Yeah.
And domesticate, well, but anyway.
That's another good example.
Right.
Not all domestication has to be domination.
Right. But dome is home.
Yeah.
Those words are probably the same in some language, right?
That's true. Yeah. I think in Latin, domus is home.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's, just thinking, okay, what dominion is what do we do to make the world our home, to ensure that the world is going to stay our home?
Yeah.
To preserve our home. That's what dominion is.
Yeah. That's beautiful. Well, geez, yeah, we have so much to talk about. I want to make sure we talk about this ecologically centered Passover Haggadah, all right, the promise of the land. And that's pretty new. That came out, just a few years ago, 2019.
Yeah, right.
So
right
it's,
when the pandemic started.
yeah, right. It comes out and then boom, pandemic. So you're like, so what does Passover look like in a pandemic? And so that seems like there's a lot of lessons that, like unintended lessons that weren't, when you wrote it, you weren't planning on there being a pandemic. And so I'm sure that brought up new meanings to it. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that project.
Sure. So about, I don't know, 5 years ago, this publisher came to me. Berman House is a Jewish press. They came to me and said, can you write a Passover Haggadah from an ecological perspective? And I thought about it in the beginning and I was like, let me think about it. I'm not sure that I can do that. And a lot of people, there's a tradition of writing Haggadahs, which is the ritual guide for Passover. That there are some very traditional ones that follow the original kind of scripting, and then there's others that are like very liberal that people take a ton of liberties with and just go in their own direction and say what they want to say to try to fit it in somehow. And I needed to take the tradition seriously. someone could write a Passover Haggadah from an environmental perspective and say what they, just make it totally environmental and not really sticking to the course.
Right.
And I wasn't going to do that. So I needed to really think about it and figure out if I could make a connection, because the primary question that you need to answer to write a Passover Haggadah from an ecological perspective is, what does freedom, which is the primary theme of what is freedom of the Jewish people, right? That's what the theme is of Passover. What does that have to do with the earth? And what does that have to do with the earth? And can I track that in our texts at all? So anyway, I had been doing all of this other work. I had written this piece called A Biblical Land Ethic, a response to Aldo Leopold. So I had been doing a lot of work, like intellectual work, of thinking about the place of land in the Bible, and thinking about land, universally. Is not just the land of Israel. The understanding, again, that eretz, which means land, can be both universal earth, and it can also mean a specific place, like Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. But you have those multiple meanings going on all at the same time. And so I became really interested in the universal meaning of Eretz, and what would happen if I looked at the Torah with this understanding of Eretz as earth, as opposed to the land of Israel. So that was the background. I'd been doing that for several years. That was the background, so I started thinking about the Haggadah, and then I just realized that this passage, that the central passage of the Passover Haggadah, did include this whole section on the land. And so I was able to talk about how you can't really be free unless you're in relationship with land. And I got to show that in the Haggadah itself, through the text itself, that like sort of text that had been cut from the original Haggadah. It was supposed to be there, but it had gotten cut. So I retrieved it, put it back in, and it was like, wow, this is really cool. There's so it's ecological from a land-centered, a land/earth-centered perspective. So that was so once I figured out that the central text of the Passover Haggadah included this landed dimension, I was able to go through the rest of it and pull out landed stuff, like, so our relationship to food coming from the land, and all of our food traditions, and the blessings that we say at the end of our meals that are in gratitude for the food and for the land that produces the food. And so there was just one thing after another that I was able to show, just these natural history, ecological dimensions, and again, the most, for me, the most important piece, that freedom, we can't be free unless we're in relationship with the land.
Yeah, especially, these days, so many debates about freedom of all kinds of sorts, and freedom of speech, or freedom to not wear a mask and things like that. And like, I think we might have a kind of impoverished understanding of what freedom is. And freedom is freedom to be in relationship with land, with your community, with your ecological community. That's such a more generative, regenerative understanding of freedom.
Yeah.
I like also that this is another case where you're letting holidays really be the guide. You're like, let's just bring back the earth into our holidays.
Right. And it's really powerful because you can just reach so many more people. It's success. It's, so the other thing about this Haggadah is it's full of art. It's very beautiful. And it's very sensual. And And I feel like, again, like, as far as I'm concerned, we always need to be thinking about how are we reaching people? Is the work that we're doing gonna, just sit on the shelves, you know, or are we going to actually be able to engage people? And so the holidays, being able to frame it in holidays in a joyous time when people are less defended, and could potentially be having conversations, about the way they're treating the land and the earth in ways that they hadn't thought about before.
Yeah.
Um, so it's just kind of sneaking all the stuff in instead of, again, this hard-headed, don't do this, you're bad if you do this, you know.
Yeah, I like that, the sneaky approach. Like just sneak it in, just bring it there, part of the celebration. You can reflect on it without having to tell people, here's what you should do. Here's how to live your life. I've got
Right.
the prescriptions for you. Just here, do this. And yeah, I appreciate that so much. I'm sure there's people who are doing research on how ineffective that approach to
Yeah.
communication is. They're like, that's not helping. In fact, you're probably hurting some causes. And
I totally think that we're hurting. I,
yeah,
I I feel like that's the divisiveness in this country. I feel like it's, we just have the right reacting to the left, and it's just
yeah,
all reaction because the language is so extreme and so, punitive,
yeah.
and people just, want to push you away.
Yeah. And then you get resentful to them, so you want to push them back. And it's just like hasn't been working. Yeah, I always think, that it was around 1990 that we passed, 350 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. That's when Bill McKibben's writing, The End of Nature and all that. And like ever since then, we've emitted more. Like we knew we had a problem, and now we're just increasing our emissions every year since then. I think it's something like half of all the carbon emissions since the Industrial Revolution, half of them we've emitted since 1990. Like that just blows my mind. I'm like, but we know what to do. How come? What's wrong? Like, well, we're communicating terribly.
Right.
And the kind of work you're doing is, I think, the perfect example of how to communicate about this stuff. You can use this as an opportunity to bridge divides, to kind of heal these divisions, and to have fun in the process, to make it festive, sensual, joyous, beautiful. I think that's, I don't know, such uplifting work. I really appreciate it. Anytime I see anybody doing anything close to this, I know I feel better. Like my shoulders can relax. And I'm like, oh, right. Sometimes I forget. Like, no, the beauty, the joy. Just let that be your guide.
Hmm. Yeah.
Well, geez, I'm looking at the time. I'm realizing I'm keeping you for a while. I always tell people, try not to keep you too long. So I think I'll go ahead and let you go. I have to have you back on sometime to share more stories. You do such cool work, and I always feel like since you're on the advisory group for the forum, that I'm allowed to kind of pick on you. Like, hey, let's do some forum
Oh yeah,
stuff.
sure. Sure.
So
We
yeah,
should definitely do something on the Song of Songs at some point.
that's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, we'll have to have a whole episode just about that
That'd
because I
be
know you do a
great.
lot of work with that, and that's another source of so much inspiration.
Yeah.
Cool. Well,
Cool.
thank you so much.
Sure. It was great chatting with you.
Yeah,
Thanks. Okay.
and thanks to people tuning in, and we'll be back next week with some more conversations for you. And in the meantime, take care and be well.